The timestamp read 2:47 a.m., and what I saw on that grainy security footage made my blood run cold. There, captured in black and white clarity, was my husband Marcus unlocking our front door with a woman who definitely wasn't me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the date stamp showing this happened 3 weeks ago, while I was supposedly alone, grieving my mother's sudden death at her bedside 2 states away. My hands trembled as I rewound the footage, hoping I'd made a mistake, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me after installing security cameras all day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The same scene played out again. Marcus Torres, my devoted husband of 12 years, sneaking into our own home like a thief in the night. His arm wrapped around a tall brunette, whose face I couldn't quite make out in the shadows. The installation of those security cameras had been Marcus's idea, actually. After the Henderson family 3 blocks over had their house burglarized last month, followed by the Kim family just 2 weeks later, our entire Brookfield Heights neighborhood had become paranoid about safety. Marcus had insisted we needed protection, especially with me being home alone so much while he traveled for his architecture firm. He'd even researched the best system himself, complete with night vision capabilities and motion sensors that would alert us to any unusual activity around our Tudor-style home on Maple Ridge Drive. I should have found it suspicious that he was so eager to install cameras everywhere, except inside the house. Only the perimeter, he'd said. We don't want to feel like we're living in a surveillance state. At the time, I'd thought it was considerate, protecting our family's privacy while keeping us safe from outside threats. Now, staring at the evidence of his betrayal glowing on my laptop screen, I realized Marcus had simply been careful about where his secrets might be recorded. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very system designed to protect us from intruders had revealed the real threat to our family was already living inside our walls. I sat in our home office, the same room where Marcus spent countless hours working on architectural plans for his clients, dream homes, and watched my own dreams crumble with each frame of that damning footage. The woman moved with familiarity through our space, not like someone seeing it for the first time. She knew exactly where to step to avoid the creaky floorboard by the stairs, the same one Tyler always hit when trying to sneak downstairs for midnight snacks. My mind raced backward through the past month, trying to reconcile this video evidence with the timeline I remembered. 3 weeks ago, I'd received the call about my mother's stroke at 6 in the morning. Marcus had been supportive, understanding, even helpful in those frantic first hours. He'd driven me to the airport himself, kissed me goodbye at the departure gate, and promised to take care of everything at home while I dealt with the medical crisis in Chicago. For 5 days, I'd juggled conversations with doctors, insurance companies, and funeral directors after Mom didn't make it through her second surgery. Marcus had called every evening, checking on me, asking about the arrangements, sounding like the caring husband I'd married. Yet here was proof that on the very night of my mother's funeral, while I was selecting songs and flowers and trying to write a eulogy that captured her spirit, Marcus was in our bedroom with another woman. The timestamp showed they'd entered at 2:47 a.m. and didn't leave until nearly sunrise. I felt physically sick thinking about him lying to me during our nightly phone calls, expressing sympathy for my loss while planning his betrayal just hours later. The security footage became my obsession over the next few days. I discovered that our system automatically saved 30 days of recordings before overwriting, which meant I had access to nearly a month of Marcus's activities. What I found made my stomach churn with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. This wasn't a one-time mistake or moment of weakness. The brunette had been in our house at least 6 times over the past month, always during hours when I was supposed to be elsewhere. She'd been there the night I took Tyler to his basketball tournament in Springfield, staying until dawn and apparently making herself quite comfortable in my kitchen based on the outdoor camera angles. She'd returned during Chloe's sleepover party at her friend Madison's house when I was supposed to be chaperoning but had come home early with a migraine. That night, I'd gone straight to bed and taken medication that knocked me out cold. Marcus had told me he was working late at the office on the Morrison project, but the footage showed him arriving home at midnight with his companion. The most devastating discovery came when I found footage from our wedding anniversary 2 months ago. Marcus had surprised me with a weekend getaway to Napa Valley, the same place we'd honeymooned 12 years earlier. He'd been unusually romantic, attentive, almost guilty in his affection. I'd thought he was trying to rekindle something in our marriage that had grown routine. The reality was that the brunette had been in our house that very weekend, using our pool, sleeping in our guest room, probably laughing at the naive wife who was grateful for her husband's renewed attention. Each piece of evidence felt like a physical blow, but I forced myself to continue watching, to document everything. I created a spreadsheet with dates, times, and activities visible in the footage. My training as an interior designer had taught me to notice details, to see patterns and inconsistencies that others might miss. Now I applied those same skills to cataloging my husband's infidelity. The woman's car appeared in several shots, always parked 2 blocks away on Elm Street, where our cameras couldn't capture the license plate clearly. She was careful, strategic in her movements, suggesting this affair was planned and ongoing, rather than spontaneous passion. She knew our schedules, our routines, our neighbors' habits. This level of coordination required someone with intimate knowledge of our family's life. During this period of discovery, I maintained complete normalcy around Marcus and the children. I continued packing Tyler's lunches, helping Chloe with her homework, attending parent-teacher conferences, and hosting our usual Sunday dinners. Marcus seemed relaxed, perhaps even happier than usual, joking with the kids and complimenting my cooking with an enthusiasm that now felt like mockery. He had no idea that I spent my nights in the office, studying footage of his betrayal frame by frame. The children, thankfully, remained oblivious to the tension building beneath our family's surface. Tyler was focused on making the school basketball team, practicing free throws in our driveway every evening after homework. Chloe was preparing for her dance recital, twirling through the house in her practice tutu and chattering about costume fittings and stage lighting. Their innocence provided both motivation and heartbreak, as I realized how much their world was about to change. I began to notice changes in Marcus's behavior that I'd previously attributed to work stress or midlife restlessness. He'd started going to the gym more frequently, updating his wardrobe with clothes that seemed younger and more fashionable than his usual conservative style. He'd grown particular about his appearance, spending extra time grooming in the mornings and being unusually concerned about cologne and hair products. His phone, once casually left around the house, now never left his side. The business trips had increased dramatically over the past 6 months. Marcus claimed his firm was expanding into new markets, requiring more travel to meet potential clients and survey project sites. I'd supported his career ambitions, understanding that his success meant security for our family. Torres & Associates had built an excellent reputation in the Brookfield area, designing custom homes for wealthy clients who demanded perfection. Marcus took pride in his work, often saying that creating someone's dream home was both an honor and a huge responsibility. Now I wondered how many of those business trips were actually romantic getaways with his brunette companion. I started cross-referencing his travel schedule with the security footage, looking for patterns that might reveal the scope of his deception. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. The nights she visited our house often corresponded with evenings, when Marcus claimed to be working late at the office or having dinner with potential clients. He wasn't even traveling for their affairs. He was conducting them in our own home while I was occupied elsewhere. The violation felt deeper than simple infidelity. This was a complete corruption of our safe space, our family sanctuary. Every room now felt contaminated by the knowledge of what had happened there. The guest room where she'd slept was the same room where my mother had stayed during her visits. The kitchen where she'd made herself coffee was where I prepared meals for my children every day. The living room where they'd presumably spent intimate time was where we watched family movies and opened Christmas presents.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I found myself studying the woman in the footage obsessively, trying to understand what Marcus saw in her that he couldn't find in me. She was taller than my 5'4" frame, with long dark hair that she wore in sophisticated styles I'd never been able to master. Her clothes were expensive, tailored, the kind of professional wardrobe I'd given up when I'd put my interior design career on hold to focus on raising Tyler and Chloe. She moved with confidence, like someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. The more I watched, the more familiar something about her seemed, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. There was something in her posture, the way she held her shoulders, that triggered a memory I couldn't quite grasp. It nagged at me during the day, surfacing at random moments while I was folding laundry or helping with homework. 3 weeks after discovering the initial footage, I finally got a clear shot of her face when she paused directly under our porch light to dig something out of her purse. I screenshot the image, enhanced it as much as possible, and felt my heart stop. I knew exactly who she was. Vanessa Reed, the city planning coordinator who'd been working with Marcus on the Morrison project approval process. I'd met her twice at city functions, once at a charity gala where she'd complimented my dress, and once at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a community center Marcus had designed. She'd seemed pleasant enough during our brief interactions, professional and polished in the way of successful women who navigated male-dominated city government. I remembered Marcus mentioning how helpful she'd been in expediting permits and navigating zoning requirements for several of his projects. He'd praised her efficiency and dedication to supporting local businesses. Now I understood the true nature of their professional relationship. The revelation that Marcus's affair partner was someone I'd actually met, someone who'd smiled at me while secretly planning to destroy my marriage, added a layer of humiliation to my pain. How many people knew about their relationship? How many professional events had I attended while others whispered about my husband's infidelity behind my back? The thought of being pitied or gossiped about made me feel simultaneously furious and mortified. I spent the next few days researching Vanessa Reed online, learning everything I could about Marcus's mystery woman. Her LinkedIn profile showed an impressive career trajectory, with degrees from prestigious universities and a track record of successful urban development projects. She was 34, 8 years younger than me, single according to her social media profiles, and apparently very good at compartmentalizing her personal and professional lives. Her Instagram showed a carefully curated life of wine tastings, art gallery openings, and weekend trips to places I recognized from Marcus's recent business travel stories. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and growing more damaging by the day. But rather than confronting Marcus immediately, I decided to dig deeper. If he could lie to me about something this fundamental, what else might he be hiding? The security cameras had revealed one secret. Perhaps there were others waiting to be uncovered. I owed it to myself and my children to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before making any decisions about our future. My marriage to Marcus Torres had always seemed like a success story. We'd met during my final year of interior design school, when he was a junior architect working for a firm that specialized in residential projects. I was interning with a designer who frequently collaborated with his company, and we'd bonded over late nights working on a particularly challenging renovation project. Marcus was ambitious, charming, and refreshingly straightforward compared to the other men I'd dated. He talked about building something lasting, both in his career and personal life. Our courtship had been wonderfully traditional. Marcus courted me with flowers, thoughtful dates, and long conversations about our dreams for the future. He wanted to start his own firm someday, designing homes that would stand for generations. I wanted to create beautiful spaces that made people feel truly at home. We seemed perfectly matched, two creative professionals who understood the demands and rewards of bringing visions to life. When Marcus proposed after 2 years together, I'd felt like the luckiest woman alive. We had a beautiful wedding at the Brookfield Country Club, surrounded by family and friends who kept commenting on what a perfect couple we made. The early years of our marriage had been everything I'd hoped for. Building careers, buying our first home, planning for children. Marcus's firm grew steadily, earning recognition for innovative designs that balanced luxury with livability. My own freelance design business flourished, with referrals from Marcus's satisfied clients keeping me busy with interesting projects. Tyler's birth had been planned and celebrated, a perfect addition to our carefully constructed life. Marcus had been an involved father from the beginning, changing diapers, taking night feedings, proudly showing off baby photos to anyone who would look. When Chloe came along 2 years later, completing our vision of the ideal family, Marcus had seemed genuinely content with our domestic happiness. Those early parenting years had been exhausting but fulfilling, filled with the kind of messy joy that made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. Gradually, though, I'd stepped back from my design work to focus more fully on raising our children. Marcus's career was demanding, requiring long hours and frequent client entertainment. It made sense for me to be the primary caregiver, ensuring Tyler and Chloe had stability and attention, while Marcus built the business that would secure our family's future. I'd told myself it was temporary, that I'd return to design work once the children were older and more independent. Years passed, and somehow temporary had become permanent. My design skills grew rusty from disuse, my professional contacts moved on to work with other designers, and my confidence in my abilities gradually eroded. Marcus, meanwhile, thrived in his role as successful architect and family provider. Torres & Associates had become one of the most respected firms in the region, with a waiting list of clients eager to work with the man who could turn their dreams into reality. I'd convinced myself that I was happy with this arrangement, that being a devoted wife and mother was its own form of achievement. Marcus certainly encouraged this belief, often praising my contributions to his success and our family's well-being. "You make everything possible," he'd say after particularly successful client meetings or project completions. "I couldn't do any of this without you holding everything together at home." Now, staring at security footage that proved how little I actually knew about my husband's life, I wondered if I'd been living in a fantasy as carefully constructed as the homes Marcus designed for his clients. Had our entire marriage been a beautiful facade covering something rotten underneath? Or had something changed along the way, transforming the man I'd fallen in love with into someone capable of such calculated betrayal? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them, each one leading to deeper doubts about everything I'd believed about our life together. If Marcus could lie about something as fundamental as fidelity, what else might he be deceiving me about? Were there financial secrets I didn't know about? Professional improprieties that could affect our family's security? The security cameras had opened a door to truth that I wasn't sure I was prepared to walk through, but I knew there was no going back to ignorant bliss. Tomorrow I would begin the process of learning exactly who my husband really was, and what that meant for the future of our family. The footage had shown me that the man I'd trusted with my life, my children, and my heart was not who I thought he was. Now I needed to figure out what to do with that devastating knowledge. The morning after identifying Vanessa Reed, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Gone was the confused, devastated woman who'd stumbled upon that first piece of footage. In her place was someone calculating, methodical, and determined to uncover every last detail of my husband's deception. I made Tyler and Chloe their usual breakfast, packed their lunches with the same care I always had, and kissed them goodbye as they headed off to school with Marcus, who complained about an early client meeting that would keep him busy most of the day. Perfect, I thought, watching his BMW disappear down Maple Ridge Drive. I had work to do. My first stop was the Brookfield Public Library, where I could use their computers without leaving a digital trail on our home network. I'd learned enough about technology from the security camera installation to know that Marcus was smart enough to monitor our internet usage if he suspected anything. The library's research databases gave me access to property records, business filings, and professional licensing information that painted a detailed picture of both Marcus and Vanessa's professional lives. What I discovered made my stomach clench with a new kind of dread. Torres & Associates had been awarded 6 major municipal contracts over the past 18 months, all requiring approval from the city planning department. The timeline coincided almost perfectly with Vanessa's hiring as coordinator. Each project had moved through the typically slow bureaucratic process with unusual speed, sometimes receiving permits in weeks that normally took months to approve. The Morrison project that Marcus had mentioned repeatedly over the past few months was particularly interesting. The proposed luxury housing development had faced significant opposition from environmental groups and neighborhood associations. Multiple public hearings had been scheduled, environmental impact studies requested, and zoning variances required. Yet somehow, every obstacle had been smoothly resolved in Torres & Associates' favor. The project was now valued at over $12 million, with Marcus's firm receiving a substantial percentage for design and project management. I printed every document I could find, creating a file that grew thicker with each discovery. Business partnerships, permit applications, zoning variance requests, environmental clearances, all bearing both Marcus's signature and Vanessa's official approval. The pattern was unmistakable. My husband's career success over the past year, hadn't been due to his architectural brilliance alone. It had been purchased with whatever services he was providing to the city planning coordinator. The professional corruption was staggering enough, but the personal betrayal ran even deeper. I found records showing that Vanessa had purchased a luxury condominium in downtown Brookfield 8 months ago, around the time their affair apparently began, based on the security footage timeline. The purchase price was well above what her city salary should have supported, even with her impressive credentials. I wondered who had helped finance her new lifestyle. From the library, I drove to downtown Brookfield, parking across the street from the address I'd found for Vanessa's condominium. The building was sleek and modern, exactly the type of upscale development that Marcus often designed for wealthy clients. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the river, and the lobby visible through glass doors showcased the kind of expensive finishes that screamed exclusivity. This wasn't housing for a mid-level city employee. This was a residence for someone with significant additional income. I sat in my car for 2 hours, watching the building's entrance and trying to work up the courage for what I planned to do next. Around noon, I saw Marcus's BMW pull into the visitor parking area. My heart rate spiked as I watched my husband step out of his car, glance around nervously, then walk confidently toward the building entrance. He had a key, I realized, with sickening certainty. This wasn't a casual visit or professional meeting. Marcus belonged here. 45 minutes later, he emerged looking relaxed and satisfied, checking his phone as he walked back to his car. The lunch meeting he'd mentioned that morning had obviously been with Vanessa, though I doubted much eating had been involved. I felt a surge of rage so intense, it made my hands shake. While I was home researching the extent of his betrayal, Marcus was casually continuing his affair, apparently confident that his naive wife would never discover the truth. That afternoon, I called Torres & Associates and asked to speak with Marcus, using my sweetest voice to get past his receptionist, Angela. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Torres," she said apologetically, "but Mr. Torres is at the Morrison site all afternoon. He said he'd be checking the foundation work and meeting with the contractor about timeline adjustments. Would you like me to have him call you?" "No need," I replied cheerfully. "I just wanted to confirm dinner plans." "Thanks, Angela." I drove straight to the Morrison development site, a sprawling construction zone on the outskirts of Brookfield, where luxury homes were supposedly being built according to Marcus's award-winning designs. The site was active with workers, heavy machinery, and supervisors coordinating various phases of construction. I parked where I could observe the main trailer that served as the on-site office, and waited to see if my husband would appear. He never did. For 3 hours, I watched workers pour concrete, frame walls, and install roofing materials, under the supervision of men in hard hats who clearly knew what they were doing. None of them was Marcus. The site foreman, when I approached him with questions about the project timeline, confirmed that the architect hadn't been there all week. "Mr. Torres usually comes by on Fridays for progress meetings," he explained. "Is there something specific you needed to discuss about the design?" I managed some excuse about wanting to surprise Marcus with lunch and left feeling more confused than ever. If he wasn't at the construction site, and his receptionist thought he was, where had Marcus really spent his afternoon after leaving Vanessa's condominium? The lies were multiplying faster than I could track them, creating a web of deception that seemed to encompass every aspect of his professional and personal life. That evening, Marcus came home exactly when he'd promised, carrying blueprints and wearing the slightly dusty clothes that suggested he'd actually been at a construction site. He kissed me hello, asked about my day, and launched into a detailed account of the foundation problems at Morrison that had required his immediate attention. The performance was flawless, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that suggested years of practice. "How was the concrete pour?" I asked innocently, remembering the afternoon's work I'd observed. "Exactly as expected," Marcus replied without hesitation. "No complications, thankfully." The contractor knows his business. The ease with which he lied to my face was breathtaking. This wasn't someone caught off guard by unexpected questions. This was someone who had constructed an entire alternate reality and could navigate it effortlessly. I began to wonder how long Marcus had been living this double life, and how many other secrets might be hidden beneath his carefully maintained facade. Over the next week, I developed a routine of surveillance that would have impressed any private investigator. I tracked Marcus's movements using a combination of security footage analysis, public records research, and careful observation of his daily patterns. What emerged was a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond a simple extramarital affair. Marcus was spending approximately 3 days per week at Vanessa's condominium, always during hours when he claimed to be working. His office schedule, which I verified through casual conversations with Angela, rarely matched his actual whereabouts. The Morrison project, which he discussed constantly at home, seemed to require far less of his attention than he claimed. Most concerning of all, several of his recent business trips had been complete fabrications. The client meetings in Chicago, the site visits in Milwaukee, the professional conference in Denver, none of them had actually happened according to the hotel and airline records I managed to access. The financial implications began to worry me as much as the personal betrayal. If Marcus was lying about his work schedule and business travel, what was happening to the money supposedly being spent on these professional activities? Our joint checking account showed regular transfers to cover his business expenses, but if those expenses were fictional, where was the money actually going? I made an appointment with our accountant, David Chen, under the pretense of planning for tax season. David had handled our finances for 8 years, preparing our returns and offering advice on investments and retirement planning. He knew our financial situation better than anyone outside our immediate family. "Mrs. Torres," David said warmly as I settled into his office, "it's a pleasure to see you. Marcus mentioned you might be taking a more active role in managing your finances. I think that's wonderful. You should understand where your money is going." The comment surprised me. When had Marcus discussed my involvement in our finances? I'd never expressed interest in taking a more active role, perfectly content to let Marcus handle the complexities of business accounting and investment management. We maintained separate roles in our marriage. He earned the money, I managed the household. It had worked perfectly for 12 years. I'm trying to get a better understanding of our overall financial picture. I explained carefully. Could you walk me through our major expenses and income sources over the past year? What David showed me made my blood run cold. Our personal savings account, which I'd believed contained nearly $100,000 for emergencies and the children's future education, had been steadily depleted over the past 18 months. Regular transfers of $5,000 to $10,000 had reduced our safety net to less than $20,000. When I asked about these withdrawals, David seemed confused. "Marcus told me you'd agreed to invest in some rental properties," he said, consulting his computer screen. "He said you wanted to diversify your portfolio beyond the stock market. These transfers were supposedly going toward down payments and renovation costs for income-generating real estate." I managed to keep my expression neutral while my mind raced. We owned no rental properties. I'd never agreed to any real estate investments. Marcus had apparently been systematically draining our savings while telling our accountant that I'd approved these financial decisions. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I felt dizzy trying to process the implications. "Where are these properties located?" I asked, hoping my voice sounded calmer than I felt. David pulled up another screen. "Let me see. Marcus mentioned something about a small apartment building in the University District, and I think there was a duplex near the river. He handles all the property management himself, so I don't have the specific addresses in my files. You'd know better than I would about the rental income and maintenance costs." I nodded as if this made perfect sense while internally screaming at the scope of Marcus's lies. He'd stolen nearly $80,000 from our family's security while convincing our accountant that I was a willing partner in these investments. The fictional rental properties explained where the money had gone, but I suspected the real destination was far different from income-generating real estate. The meeting with David Chen marked a turning point in my investigation. What had begun as heartbreak over Marcus's affair had evolved into something far more serious: potential fraud, theft, and professional corruption that could destroy our family's financial future. I was no longer just a betrayed wife seeking answers. I was a woman whose husband had systematically robbed her children's security while conducting business with criminal disregard for ethics and legality. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, I spent hours in our home office creating a comprehensive timeline of his deceptions. The security footage provided concrete evidence of his affair with Vanessa Reed. The business records showed a pattern of professionally questionable permit approvals. The financial documents revealed the theft of our family savings under false pretenses. Each piece of evidence was damning on its own. Together, they painted a picture of a man whose entire life had become an elaborate criminal enterprise. I realized that confronting Marcus directly would be worse than useless. It would give him time to destroy evidence, transfer remaining assets, and construct new lies to explain away what I'd discovered. Instead, I needed professional help from people trained to deal with fraud, corruption, and financial crimes. The naive wife who'd trusted her husband's explanations was gone forever. In her place was someone determined to protect her children's future and see justice done, no matter how painful the process might be. The next morning, I called Patricia Kim, a private investigator whose business card I'd found in the phone book. I explained that I needed someone to help document potential financial fraud and professional corruption, carefully avoiding specific details over the phone. Patricia suggested we meet at Riverside Coffee House, a small establishment across town where we were unlikely to encounter anyone from my usual social circles. Patricia turned out to be a former police detective who specialized in white-collar crime investigations. She listened to my story without judgment, taking notes on a tablet while I explained the security footage, financial discrepancies, and business irregularities I'd discovered. Her questions were sharp and focused, clearly those of someone who understood how criminal enterprises operated and what kind of evidence would be needed to prove wrongdoing. "Mrs. Torres," Patricia said after I'd finished my account, "what you're describing suggests several potential crimes: embezzlement, bribery, fraud, and possibly money laundering. These are serious federal offenses that could result in significant prison time if proven in court. Are you prepared for the possibility that your husband could face criminal charges?" The question forced me to confront the reality of what I was pursuing. Part of me still loved the man I'd married, the father of my children, the architect who'd built our beautiful life together. But that man might never have existed at all. The Marcus I'd discovered through weeks of investigation was a stranger capable of betraying everything I'd believed we valued together. "I want to protect my children," I told Patricia firmly. "Whatever that requires, I'm prepared to do." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Then we need to build an airtight case before your husband realizes what's happening. Once he knows you're investigating, he'll try to destroy evidence and possibly transfer assets to hide them from any legal proceedings. We have one advantage. He doesn't suspect you know anything yet. We need to use that window of opportunity to gather everything we'll need." Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia and I worked together to document every aspect of Marcus's deceptions. She taught me how to properly photograph documents, preserve digital evidence, and maintain a chain of custody that would hold up in court. We installed additional surveillance equipment that could capture higher quality images and audio recordings. Most importantly, she connected me with federal investigators who specialized in municipal corruption cases. Agent Sarah Collins from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division agreed to meet with us after Patricia provided a preliminary overview of our evidence. Agent Collins was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, but she demonstrated immediate grasp of the complex relationships between Marcus's business success, Vanessa's permit approvals, and the financial irregularities in our personal accounts. "Mrs. Torres," Agent Collins said during our first meeting, "corruption cases like this often involve multiple participants and can take months or years to fully investigate. Are you willing to cooperate with a federal investigation that might require you to wear recording devices, document conversations, and potentially testify against your husband in court?" The weight of her questions settled over me like a physical presence. Agreeing to cooperate with federal investigators would mean crossing a line from which there would be no return. Marcus would learn eventually that I'd been the source of evidence against him. Our marriage would be over, our children's lives would be turned upside down, and I'd become a central figure in a criminal case that would probably make headlines in our small community. But the alternative was allowing Marcus to continue stealing from our family, corrupting public officials and living a lie that could collapse at any moment with even more devastating consequences. At least this way, I had some control over the timing and circumstances. At least this way, I could try to protect Tyler and Chloe from the worst of the fallout. Yes, I told Agent Collins. I'll do whatever is necessary. The next phase of the investigation would require me to become an active participant in gathering evidence, while maintaining the appearance of being Marcus's unsuspecting wife. It was a role that would test every acting ability I possessed, but I was determined to see it through to the end. My children deserved a future built on truth rather than lies, even if discovering that truth meant destroying the only life they'd ever known. The recording device was smaller than a button, nearly invisible when clipped inside the collar of my blouse. Agent Collins had spent an hour teaching me how to activate it discreetly and position myself for optimal audio quality. The weight of it against my throat felt enormous, though I knew it was barely detectable. Today would be my first attempt at gathering direct evidence of Marcus's criminal activities, and my hands trembled slightly as I prepared breakfast for my unsuspecting family. Marcus was in an unusually good mood, humming while he read emails on his phone and complimenting my coffee with genuine enthusiasm. Tyler and Chloe chattered about their upcoming school events, blissfully unaware that their mother was wearing a wire and planning to record their father's potentially incriminating conversations. The normalcy of the morning felt surreal, like performing in a play where only I knew the real script. After the children left for school, Marcus lingered over his second cup of coffee, checking his calendar and making notes about client meetings. This was my opportunity to probe about the Morrison project and the mysterious rental properties that had drained our savings account. I'd rehearsed casual questions with Agent Collins, designed to elicit information without arousing suspicion. "The Morrison development seems to be moving along quickly," I commented while clearing breakfast dishes. "You must be pleased with how smoothly everything has gone through the approval process." Marcus looked up from his phone, and for a moment I thought I detected weariness in his expression. Then his usual confident smile returned, and he launched into what I now recognized as a carefully prepared explanation about his professional competence and the quality of his architectural plans. "When you submit thorough documentation and follow proper procedures, the city has no choice but to approve legitimate projects," he said, with the tone of someone explaining something obvious. "Too many architects cut corners on environmental studies and zoning research, then wonder why their permits get delayed. The city planning office must be more efficient than I realized," I replied, keeping my voice light and conversational. "Vanessa Reed seems particularly helpful when I've seen her at community events." Marcus's reaction was immediate and telling. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he set down his coffee cup with slightly more force than necessary. When he spoke, his voice had an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Vanessa is professional and competent," he said carefully. "The planning department has improved significantly since she took over coordination duties. She understands that economic development benefits the entire community." I'd hit a nerve, and the recording device captured every nuance of his defensive response. Marcus was clearly uncomfortable discussing Vanessa in any context, even one that seemed innocuous. His reaction suggested guilt that went beyond simple embarrassment about an extramarital affair. Over the following days, I refined my technique for drawing information from Marcus while he remained unaware of being recorded. I learned to ask questions that seemed motivated by curiosity about his work rather than suspicion about his activities. Gradually, I pieced together details about his relationship with Vanessa that painted a picture of systematic corruption disguised as professional cooperation. The breakthrough came during a dinner conversation about Tyler's interest in architecture. Marcus was explaining how city planning affected residential design when he mentioned specific zoning variances that had been approved for the Morrison project. According to him, environmental restrictions that typically prevented development near the river had been waived based on new geological surveys that showed minimal ecological impact. I researched those geological surveys the next day and discovered they'd been conducted by a consulting firm owned by Vanessa's brother-in-law. The surveys had been completed in record time and reached conclusions that contradicted previous environmental studies of the same area. More disturbing still, the consulting firm had been paid directly by Torres and Associates rather than the city, creating a clear conflict of interest that should have invalidated their findings. Agent Collins was fascinated by this development when I shared the recordings and documentation. "This is exactly the kind of evidence we need," she explained during one of our weekly meetings at a small restaurant outside Brookfield. "Your husband essentially paid for favorable environmental reports through a company connected to his co-conspirator, then used those reports to justify permits that shouldn't have been approved." The federal investigation was expanding beyond Marcus and Vanessa to include the consulting firm, several other developers who'd received unusually quick permit approvals, and potentially other city officials who might have been involved in the corruption scheme. What had started as my personal quest for truth about my husband's affair had evolved into a major white-collar crime investigation with implications throughout the regional construction industry. Meanwhile, my home life continued its bizarre routine of normalcy, punctuated by evidence gathering. Marcus maintained his schedule of supposed business meetings that were actually visits to Vanessa's condominium. He brought home architectural plans and construction photos that supported his cover stories about site visits and client consultations. He discussed future projects with enthusiasm that seemed genuine, apparently believing his own lies about legitimate business success. The children remained completely unaware of the investigation swirling around their father. Tyler made the basketball team and started bringing friends home for pickup games in our driveway. Chloe's dance recital was approaching, and she practiced her routines every evening, while I helped with homework and tried to maintain some semblance of normal family life. Their innocence was both heartbreaking and motivating. I was fighting to preserve their financial future and protect them from having a father in federal prison. Patricia Kim had been working parallel investigations into Marcus's financial activities, following money trails that led to offshore accounts and shell companies I'd never heard of. Her findings were staggering in their scope and sophistication. Marcus hadn't simply been stealing from our family savings. He'd constructed an elaborate network of fraudulent businesses designed to launder bribes and hide assets from potential legal scrutiny. The rental properties David Chen had mentioned were completely fictional, existing only as paperwork filed with falsified addresses and manufactured documentation. The money supposedly invested in these properties had actually been funneled through a series of limited liability companies that existed solely to obscure the flow of funds between Torres and Associates and various municipal officials. Vanessa Reed was receiving regular payments disguised as consulting fees for urban planning advice, but the amounts far exceeded what such services would legitimately cost. Most shocking of all, Patricia discovered that Marcus had been preparing for the possibility of federal investigation for over a year. He'd established accounts in the Cayman Islands and purchased cryptocurrency wallets that could be accessed from anywhere in the world. If he realized the authorities were closing in, he had the means to disappear with millions of dollars while leaving his family to face the legal consequences of his crimes. This revelation changed everything about my cooperation with the FBI investigation. What had seemed like a matter of gathering evidence against a corrupt architect became an urgent race to prevent a sophisticated criminal from fleeing the country with stolen money. Agent Collins immediately elevated the case priority and began coordinating with international financial crime units to monitor Marcus's offshore activities. The recording equipment became more sophisticated as the investigation intensified. I wore multiple devices designed to capture both audio and video evidence of Marcus's activities. My purse contained a camera that could document any papers or electronic devices he left accessible. The home security system we'd installed to catch burglars now served to monitor my husband's movements and record any conversations he might have with co-conspirators. The irony wasn't lost on me that the technology Marcus had insisted we install for protection was now being used to gather evidence for his prosecution. Every camera angle he'd carefully positioned to monitor external threats now provided law enforcement with detailed documentation of his criminal activities. The system designed to keep our family safe was revealing how much danger we'd actually been in from the threat living inside our own home. 3 weeks into my active cooperation with federal investigators, Marcus received a phone call that changed his entire demeanor. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when his phone rang, and his reaction to the caller ID made me immediately suspicious. He glanced around nervously before answering, then walked quickly to his home office and closed the door firmly behind him. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, conducted in low tones that I couldn't overhear despite positioning myself as close to the office as possible. When Marcus finally emerged, his face was pale, and his usually confident posture had collapsed into something resembling panic. He claimed the call had been about construction delays on a project in Milwaukee, but his obvious distress suggested something far more serious than scheduling problems. That night, Marcus was restless and distracted, checking his phone repeatedly and making several more calls from the privacy of our backyard. I activated my recording device and managed to capture fragments of conversations that mentioned federal audits, document destruction, and timeline acceleration. It was clear that something had spooked him badly, though I couldn't determine whether he'd learned about the investigation or simply received a warning from another participant in the corruption scheme. Agent Collins was concerned when I reported Marcus's changed behavior during our next meeting. If he suspects he's under investigation, he might try to destroy evidence or flee the country before we can make arrests, she warned. We may need to accelerate our timeline and move forward with search warrants and charges sooner than originally planned. The possibility of immediate legal action sent a chill through me. I'd been focused so intently on gathering evidence that I hadn't fully processed what would happen when the investigation became public. Marcus would be arrested, probably at our home where Tyler and Chloe might witness their father being taken away in handcuffs. Our family would become the center of a media circus, as news outlets covered the corruption scandal. The children would learn that their father was a criminal and their mother had been working with law enforcement to build the case against him. But the alternative was potentially worse. If Marcus fled the country, he'd leave his family to face the financial and legal consequences of his crimes, while living comfortably on stolen money in a jurisdiction that wouldn't extradite him back to the United States. Tyler and Chloe would grow up knowing their father had abandoned them to escape justice for crimes that had robbed their future security. I spent that night lying awake next to my sleeping husband, listening to his breathing and trying to reconcile the man I'd loved for 12 years with the criminal, whose activities I'd been documenting for weeks. The Marcus I'd married had been ambitious and determined, but I'd believed his ambitions were legitimate and his methods ethical. Now I wondered if I'd ever really known him at all, or if the caring husband and devoted father had always been just another performance designed to maintain his cover. The next morning brought a development that forced immediate action from federal investigators. Marcus left early for what he claimed was a breakfast meeting with potential clients, but the security footage showed him loading multiple boxes and a laptop bag into his car before driving away. Patricia Kim's surveillance team followed him to a storage facility where he spent 2 hours, apparently moving items between units and making several phone calls. Agent Collins called an emergency meeting for that afternoon. "We think your husband is preparing to destroy evidence or flee," she informed me bluntly. "We're going to execute search warrants tomorrow morning before he has a chance to eliminate more documentation. I need you to ensure that you and your children are somewhere safe when this happens." The reality of what I'd set in motion crashed over me with devastating force. Tomorrow morning, federal agents would search my home, arrest my husband, and begin the process that would destroy the only life my children had ever known. There would be no going back, no possibility of working things out privately or protecting Tyler and Chloe from the truth about their father's criminal activities. But as I sat in Agent Collins' office, surrounded by evidence of Marcus's systematic betrayal of everything I'd believed we valued together, I knew I'd made the only choice possible. My children deserved a future built on truth rather than lies, even if that truth was painful beyond anything I could have imagined. Marcus had chosen his path when he decided to steal from his family and corrupt public officials for personal gain. Now he would face the consequences of those choices, and I would do everything possible to protect Tyler and Chloe from the worst of the fallout. The investigation phase was ending, and the confrontation phase was about to begin. Everything I'd discovered about my husband's double life would soon become public knowledge, and the careful facade of our perfect family would crumble under the weight of federal charges and media attention. I'd gathered the evidence needed to seek justice, but the cost of that justice was going to be higher than I'd ever imagined possible. The federal agents arrived at dawn, their black SUVs pulling into our driveway with the precision of a military operation. I watched from my sister Nicole's apartment window 3 miles away, my hands clenched around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Tyler and Chloe were still asleep in the guest room, blissfully unaware that their father was about to be arrested, and their childhood homes searched by law enforcement officers carrying boxes of evidence bags and computer forensics equipment. Agent Collins had insisted that the children and I be safely away during the raid, both for our protection and to avoid traumatizing Tyler and Chloe with the sight of their father in handcuffs. I'd manufactured a story about spending the night at Nicole's after a late movie, something we did occasionally when Marcus traveled for business. The children had been excited about the impromptu sleepover, never suspecting it was designed to shield them from watching their world collapse in real time. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Collins at exactly 6:37 in the morning. Package delivered. Recipient surprised but cooperative. The coded message meant Marcus had been arrested without incident, probably still in his pajamas, and completely caught off guard by the FBI agents at our front door. I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief, knowing that the man I'd shared a bed with for 12 years was now in federal custody, while agents systematically dismantled the life we'd built together. The search would take most of the day, Agent Collins had warned me. Federal investigators would photograph every room, copy every computer file, and examine every document that might contain evidence of Marcus's crimes. They'd found the hidden safe I hadn't even known existed, located behind a false panel in Marcus's office closet. Inside were records of offshore accounts, cryptocurrency wallet passwords, and detailed notes about bribes paid to various municipal officials over the past 3 years. Nicole poured herself coffee and settled beside me at her kitchen table, her expression carefully neutral as she watched me stare out the window toward our neighborhood. My younger sister had always been protective, even more so since her own divorce 2 years earlier had left her suspicious of men who seemed too good to be true. She'd never particularly liked Marcus, though she'd kept her reservations mostly to herself during our marriage. "You don't have to pretend this isn't what you wanted," Nicole said quietly. "I've seen how miserable you've been for months, even before you found out about the affair. This investigation gave you a way out of a marriage that was suffocating you." Her words stung, because they contained more truth than I wanted to acknowledge. The past few weeks of systematic evidence gathering had been the most purposeful and engaged I'd felt in years. Working with Agent Collins and Patricia Kim had reminded me of capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed, analytical skills that had been dormant during my years of domestic routine. The investigation had given me a mission beyond organizing school fundraisers and maintaining Marcus's professional image. But the cost of that purpose was devastating for Tyler and Chloe, who would wake up this morning to discover their father was a federal criminal, and their mother had been working with law enforcement to build the case against him. No amount of personal liberation was worth traumatizing my children, yet I couldn't see any alternative path that would have protected them from Marcus's eventual downfall. The phone call I'd been dreading came at 9:15. Marcus was allowed one call from federal custody, and he chose to use it on me rather than his lawyer. His voice was strained, but still carried the authoritative tone he used when convinced he could control any situation through force of personality. "Rachel, there's been a misunderstanding," he said without preamble. "Federal agents seem to think I've been involved in some kind of fraud scheme. I need you to call Benjamin Cross immediately and tell him to meet me at the federal courthouse. This will all be sorted out once we explain the legitimate business relationships involved." The audacity was breathtaking. Even after being arrested with evidence of bribery and embezzlement in his possession, Marcus was maintaining his innocence and expecting me to facilitate his defense. He had no idea that I'd been working with federal investigators for weeks, gathering the very evidence that had led to his arrest. In his mind, I was still the supportive wife who would automatically rally to his aid during a crisis. "I'll make some calls," I replied carefully, aware that this conversation was probably being recorded by federal authorities. "Where are the children supposed to go to school today if agents are searching our house?" "Don't worry about that now," Marcus said dismissively. "This will be resolved quickly, and we'll be back to normal by this afternoon. Just focus on getting Benjamin involved so we can clear up these ridiculous charges." The call ended with Marcus still convinced that his arrest was a temporary inconvenience rather than the beginning of a federal prosecution that would destroy his career and potentially send him to prison for decades. His confidence was either genuine delusion or a performance designed to maintain control over a situation that had already spiraled completely beyond his influence. Agent Collins called 20 minutes later with an update on the search results. The evidence they'd found exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. Marcus had kept detailed records of every bribe, every favor, and every illegal transaction he'd conducted over the past 3 years. His computer files contained spreadsheets tracking payments to Vanessa Reed and at least 6 other municipal officials. His hidden safe had yielded contracts for fictional consulting services that were actually structured bribes to ensure favorable treatment for Torres and Associates projects. Most damning of all, they'd discovered a second set of financial records showing the true scope of Marcus's theft from our family assets. The missing $80,000 from our savings account was just the beginning. He'd been systematically draining our retirement funds, the children's education accounts, and even the equity in our home through a series of fraudulent loan applications. Our family's total financial losses exceeded $300,000. Money that had been funneled through shell companies to offshore accounts Marcus controlled exclusively. "Mrs. Torres," Agent Collins said, her voice gentle but firm, "your husband was preparing to disappear with everything your family owned. If this investigation hadn't moved forward when it did, you and your children would have been left with massive debts and no assets to pay them. He wasn't just stealing from the city, he was stealing your entire future." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just been unfaithful and corrupt. He'd been planning to abandon his family after robbing them of everything they owned. The man I'd trusted with my life and my children's security had been systematically dismantling our financial foundation while maintaining the facade of loving husband and devoted father. Every family dinner, every school event, every intimate moment we'd shared during the past few years had been conducted while he planned our ultimate betrayal. I hung up the phone and immediately vomited into Nicole's kitchen sink, my body rejecting the reality of what I'd learned about my husband's intentions. Tyler and Chloe were finally stirring in the guest room, and I could hear them discussing plans for the day while completely unaware that their father was in federal custody, and their financial future had been stolen by the man they trusted most in the world. The next few hours passed in a surreal blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and conversations with social workers assigned to ensure the children's welfare during the crisis. Benjamin Cross, Marcus's lawyer, called repeatedly trying to understand what evidence federal prosecutors might have against his client. I referred him to Agent Collins while maintaining the fiction that I was as surprised by the arrest as everyone else. By noon, the story had broken in local news outlets. Torres and Associates architect arrested in federal corruption probe. The headlines were accompanied by photos of Marcus being led away in handcuffs and shots of our home surrounded by law enforcement vehicles. My phone began ringing constantly with calls from reporters, neighbors, and acquaintances who'd seen the coverage and wanted details about the scandal that had apparently been developing under everyone's noses. Tyler and Chloe were watching cartoons when the first news report appeared on television. I managed to change the channel before they saw their father's arrest footage, but I knew their classmates would start talking about it by the time school ended that afternoon. There was no way to protect them from learning the truth, but I wanted to control how and when they received that devastating information. The conversation I'd been dreading took place in Nicole's living room at 2 o'clock that afternoon. I sat both children down and explained, as gently as possible, that their father had been arrested for making bad choices in his business. Tyler, at 10 years old, immediately understood the seriousness of the situation and peppered me with questions about what would happen next. Chloe, at 8, was more confused than frightened, asking repeatedly when Daddy would come home and whether they'd done something wrong. The hardest part was explaining why we couldn't go back to our house immediately. Federal agents were still processing evidence, and even after they finished, our home would never feel the same. The security cameras that had revealed Marcus's affair now felt like symbols of surveillance and deception rather than protection. Every room held memories that had been poisoned by knowledge of what Marcus had really been doing while I believed we were building a life together. Benjamin Cross requested a meeting that evening, ostensibly to discuss legal strategy but actually to probe how much I knew about Marcus's activities. He was a skilled attorney who specialized in white-collar defense, and his questions were designed to determine whether I might be considered a co-conspirator or simply an innocent victim of my husband's crimes. I answered carefully, maintaining the pretense of shocked ignorance while avoiding any statements that might compromise the federal investigation. Mr. Cross seemed satisfied that I posed no threat to Marcus's defense, probably assuming that any wife naive enough to be completely unaware of her husband's crimes was unlikely to possess information that could damage his case. He explained that federal prosecutors would probably offer Marcus a plea agreement in exchange for cooperation against other participants in the corruption scheme, particularly Vanessa Reed and the municipal officials who'd accepted bribes. What he didn't know was that Marcus had already implicated himself through the recordings I'd made during our supposedly casual conversations about his work. The evidence I'd gathered with federal investigators was comprehensive enough that prosecutors didn't need Marcus's cooperation to build cases against his co-conspirators. His only real option would be accepting responsibility for his crimes and hoping for leniency based on his previous lack of criminal history. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving me a weekend to prepare Tyler and Chloe for the media attention that would inevitably accompany their father's first court appearance. Local news stations were already running stories about municipal corruption in Brookfield, and investigative reporters were digging into the backgrounds of everyone connected to the scandal. Our family's private life would become public entertainment as journalists competed to provide the most comprehensive coverage of the corruption scheme. Patricia Kim called Sunday evening with intelligence about Vanessa Reed's reaction to Marcus's arrest. Federal agents had searched her condominium and City Hall office, seizing computers and documents that contained evidence of her participation in the bribery scheme. Unlike Marcus, Vanessa had immediately requested a lawyer and refused to make any statements to investigators. Her strategy was apparently going to be claiming that Marcus had coerced her participation through threats or manipulation, painting herself as another victim rather than a willing accomplice. The irony was that Vanessa's defense strategy contained elements of truth. While she'd certainly benefited financially from her relationship with Marcus, the power dynamic between them was complicated by his professional success and her dependence on his business for much of her department's favorable reputation with city administrators. A skilled defense attorney could argue that Vanessa had been pressured into accepting bribes to maintain her position and advance her career. But federal prosecutors had evidence showing that Vanessa had initiated contact with other developers seeking similar arrangements, suggesting that her corruption extended beyond her relationship with Marcus. The consulting firm, owned by her brother-in-law, had provided fraudulent environmental reports for multiple projects, not just those connected to Torres and Associates. Her criminal enterprise was broader and more systematic than simple extortion by a manipulative architect. Sunday night, I lay awake in Nicole's guest room, listening to my children's peaceful breathing and trying to process the magnitude of what the next few weeks would bring. Marcus would probably spend months in federal custody awaiting trial, unless he could make bail on charges that carried potential sentences of 20 years or more. Our home would eventually be released from evidence status, but returning there would mean confronting memories and spaces that had been permanently contaminated by knowledge of Marcus's deception. The financial recovery would take years, assuming it was possible at all. Federal investigators had frozen Marcus's offshore accounts, but recovering stolen money from international banks was a complex process that often yielded only partial restitution. The children's education funds were gone, our retirement savings had been depleted, and our home equity had been compromised by fraudulent loans that would need to be resolved through lengthy legal proceedings. Most challenging of all would be rebuilding some sense of normal family life for Tyler and Chloe while their father faced federal prosecution and possible imprisonment. They would need counseling to process the trauma of learning their father was a criminal, therapy to address the abandonment issues that would inevitably develop, and constant reassurance that his crimes didn't reflect on their worth or their future possibilities. As dawn approached, I realized that the woman who had discovered her husband's affair through security camera footage no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, more calculating, and infinitely more aware of how completely trusted people could betray everything they claimed to value. The investigation had revealed not just Marcus's crimes, but my own capacity for strategic thinking and decisive action when my children's welfare was threatened. Tomorrow would bring the first court appearance, media coverage, and public acknowledgement of what had really been happening behind the facade of our perfect family life. The confrontation phase was beginning, and there would be no more pretending that our marriage had been anything other than an elaborate deception designed to provide cover for systematic criminal activity. Marcus would finally face the consequences of his choices, and I would begin the long process of building an authentic life for my children from the ruins of the lies we'd all been living. The federal courthouse in downtown Brookfield buzzed with reporters and camera crews when I arrived for Marcus's arraignment hearing. I'd deliberately chosen a seat in the back of the courtroom, hoping to observe the proceedings without becoming a focal point for media attention. Tyler and Chloe were safely at school, their first day back since their father's arrest, under strict instructions to avoid speaking with reporters who might approach them during lunch or after classes. Marcus entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit that made him look older and smaller than the confident architect who'd kissed me goodbye just a week earlier. His usual perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and the expensive watch he'd worn every day of our marriage had been replaced with standard jail-issued accessories. When his eyes swept the courtroom, they found mine immediately, and I saw a flash of something that might have been gratitude before his expression hardened into the mask of wounded innocence he'd perfected during our phone conversations. Federal prosecutor Amanda Walsh laid out charges that painted Marcus as the central figure in a corruption scheme involving 12 municipal officials, 8 construction companies, and fraudulent contracts worth over $40 million. The scope was staggering, far beyond anything I'd imagined when I first discovered that security camera footage of his affair. What had started as personal betrayal had evolved into a criminal enterprise that had corrupted Brookfield's entire development approval process for nearly 4 years. Marcus's bail hearing revealed just how extensively he'd prepared for potential flight from prosecution. Federal agents testified about the offshore accounts, cryptocurrency wallets, and forged documents found in his possession. Most damning was evidence that he'd been researching countries without extradition treaties with the United States, and had already transferred significant assets to accounts in those jurisdictions. The judge denied bail, determining that Marcus posed too great a flight risk to be released pending trial. Benjamin Cross argued vigorously for house arrest with electronic monitoring, claiming that Marcus's family ties and community connections made him unlikely to flee. What he didn't know was that federal investigators had recordings of Marcus discussing his escape plans with unknown co-conspirators, conversations captured through wiretaps authorized after my initial cooperation provided probable cause for expanded surveillance. The prosecutor's response was devastating. Mr. Torres had already demonstrated his willingness to abandon his family by systematically stealing their financial security while planning his own disappearance. As I sat in that courtroom listening to federal prosecutors describe my husband's crimes in clinical detail, I realized that the man I'd been married to for 12 years had never really existed. The caring father who'd coached Tyler's Little League team had been simultaneously stealing his son's college fund. The supportive husband who'd encouraged my design ambitions had been planning to disappear with everything we'd built together. Every memory of our marriage was now tainted by the knowledge that Marcus had been performing the role of devoted family man while systematically betraying everything that role represented. After the hearing, Benjamin Cross approached me in the courthouse hallway with a proposition that revealed just how desperate Marcus's legal situation had become. His client was now willing to consider a plea agreement that would require full cooperation with federal investigators, including testimony against other participants in the corruption scheme. In exchange, prosecutors might recommend a reduced sentence that would allow Marcus to see his children again before they reached adulthood. The offer required my input because any plea agreement would need to address restitution for the money Marcus had stolen from our family accounts. Federal investigators had recovered some assets from his offshore accounts, but the complex international banking arrangements meant that full recovery could take years, or might prove impossible entirely. A plea agreement could expedite the process and ensure that Tyler and Chloe received at least partial compensation for their father's theft of their financial security. I told Cross I needed time to consider the implications with my own attorney, but privately I'd already decided that Marcus could face the full consequences of his choices without any assistance from me. He'd shown no consideration for his family's welfare when he'd chosen to steal from us, and I felt no obligation to help minimize the legal consequences of his criminal behavior. If he wanted to cooperate with prosecutors, that was his decision to make, but he wouldn't be doing it with my blessing or support. The media coverage intensified over the following weeks as federal investigators arrested additional participants in the corruption scheme. Vanessa Reed was charged with accepting bribes, conspiracy, and money laundering. The environmental consulting firm owned by her brother-in-law was raided, yielding evidence of fraudulent reports that had enabled dozens of inappropriate development projects. 6 other municipal officials were indicted on various corruption charges, and several construction companies faced civil penalties for their participation in the bid rigging scheme. Tyler and Chloe struggled with the constant media attention and the whispered conversations that followed them through school hallways and grocery stores. Their father's crimes had made our family notorious in Brookfield, and the children bore the social consequences of his choices, despite having no knowledge of or participation in his criminal activities. I enrolled them in counseling sessions with Dr. Margaret Stevens, a child psychologist who specialized in helping families cope with parental criminal behavior. The therapy sessions revealed how much Tyler and Chloe had internalized guilt and shame about their father's actions. Tyler especially seemed to believe that he should have somehow detected his father's dishonesty and prevented the family's destruction. Chloe was more confused than angry, repeatedly asking whether Daddy would come home for Christmas or her birthday party. Dr. Stevens worked patiently with both children to help them understand that adults' choices were not their responsibility, and that their father's crimes didn't diminish their own worth or potential. Financial recovery proved even more challenging than emotional healing. Federal investigators had managed to freeze approximately $200,000 in Marcus's offshore accounts, but the legal process for recovering those funds would take months or years to complete. The fraudulent loans against our home equity had left us owing money we'd never actually received, and the mortgage company was threatening foreclosure proceedings unless the debt was resolved quickly. Patricia Kim helped me navigate the complex process of filing victim impact statements and asset recovery claims with federal prosecutors. The paperwork was overwhelming, requiring detailed documentation of every financial loss our family had suffered as a result of Marcus's criminal activities. Beyond the direct theft from our accounts, we'd also lost Marcus's income, faced legal expenses for my own representation, and incurred costs for emergency housing and counseling services that insurance didn't cover. Agent Collins remained in contact throughout the pretrial process, occasionally requesting clarification about evidence I'd helped gather during the investigation phase. She was particularly interested in my recorded conversations with Marcus about the Morrison project and other developments that had received suspicious permit approvals. Those recordings had provided crucial evidence about his knowledge of the bribery scheme and his active participation in corrupting the municipal approval process. 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I received an unexpected visitor at Nicole's apartment, where the children and I had been staying, while federal investigators finished processing our home. Vanessa Reed stood at the door looking exhausted and defeated, wearing the kind of inexpensive clothes that suggested her financial circumstances had changed dramatically since her own arrest and loss of employment. She asked if we could talk privately, and despite my initial instinct to slam the door in her face, curiosity got the better of me. We sat in Nicole's small living room while Tyler and Chloe played in the backyard, and Vanessa delivered an apology that was both unexpected and insufficient for the damage she'd helped inflict on my family. "I need you to know that Marcus told me your marriage was over," she said quietly. "He said you'd agreed to divorce but were waiting until after the children finished the school year. I never would have gotten involved if I'd known he was lying about that, too." The revelation was another layer of betrayal to add to the growing pile. Marcus had apparently used our family as leverage for his affair, convincing Vanessa that she wasn't destroying a marriage, but simply providing comfort to a man whose wife had already checked out emotionally. His manipulation had been sophisticated enough to recruit a willing accomplice who believed she was supporting someone through a difficult transition rather than participating in adultery. Vanessa also revealed details about the corruption scheme that federal investigators hadn't shared with me. The bribery network had been operating for years before Marcus became involved, originally organized by a previous city planning director who'd retired just before federal investigators began examining suspicious permit approvals. Marcus had inherited the existing system and expanded it dramatically, increasing both the scope of corruption and the amount of money flowing through fraudulent consulting arrangements. More disturbing still, Vanessa claimed that Marcus had been planning to expose the entire corruption network to federal investigators as part of a plea agreement that would position him as a cooperating witness rather than a primary defendant. His arrest had apparently disrupted a carefully planned strategy where he would have claimed to be gathering evidence of municipal corruption while positioning himself as an undercover informant rather than an active participant. I don't know if that's true, Vanessa concluded, but Marcus always talked about having an exit strategy if things went wrong. He said the most important thing was protecting his family's future, even if it meant sacrificing some of his business relationships. The conversation left me feeling more confused than enlightened about Marcus's motivations and intentions. Was he a calculating criminal who'd systematically betrayed his family for personal gain? Or a man who'd gotten caught up in an existing corruption scheme and then tried desperately to find a way out that would protect his children's welfare? The security camera footage that had started this entire investigation couldn't answer those deeper questions about his character and intentions. Marcus's trial was scheduled for the following spring, but he ultimately accepted a plea agreement that avoided the need for public testimony from family members and co-conspirators. He pleaded guilty to federal charges of bribery, money laundering, and fraud in exchange for a recommended sentence of 12 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 8 years. The agreement also required him to forfeit all remaining assets and cooperate fully with ongoing investigations into municipal corruption throughout the region. I attended the sentencing hearing with Tyler and Chloe, who had asked to see their father one final time before he disappeared into the federal prison system. Marcus looked directly at us when the judge asked if he had anything to say before imposing sentence. His statement was brief, but seemed genuinely remorseful in a way that his earlier protestations of innocence had not. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom, "I've destroyed the most important things in my life through choices that were selfish and inexcusable. My children deserved a father who protected their future, rather than stealing from it. My wife deserved a husband who honored his commitments, rather than betraying them for personal gain. I accept full responsibility for my actions and the harm they've caused to my family and this community." The judge sentenced Marcus to 10 years in federal prison, slightly less than the maximum recommended under his plea agreement, but still enough to ensure that Tyler and Chloe would be adults before their father was eligible for release. The sentence included restitution requirements that would continue even after his release from prison, meaning that Marcus would be financially responsible for the damage he'd caused for the rest of his life. As federal marshals led Marcus away in shackles, he turned once to look at our family sitting in the gallery. Tyler was crying quietly, and Chloe was asking in a whisper why Daddy had to go away for so long. I felt a complex mixture of justice, grief, and relief. The man who'd systematically betrayed everything I'd believed we valued together was finally facing consequences for his choices, but those consequences would also deprive my children of their father during their formative teenage years. The financial recovery process continued for another year, ultimately yielding approximately 60% of the money Marcus had stolen from our family accounts. Federal investigators had been successful in freezing and recovering most of the offshore assets, but legal fees and international banking complications reduced the final restitution amount. The house on Maple Ridge Drive was eventually sold to help pay the fraudulent loans Marcus had obtained, and we used the remaining equity along with recovered funds to purchase a smaller home in a different neighborhood where the children could attend new schools without constant reminders of their father's notoriety. I gradually rebuilt my interior design practice, starting with small residential projects and slowly expanding as my confidence and professional network recovered from the association with Marcus's criminal activities. The skills I'd developed during the federal investigation, attention to detail, systematic documentation, strategic thinking, proved surprisingly valuable in business development and client relationship management. In many ways, the process of exposing Marcus's corruption had reminded me of capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed during my years of domestic routine. Tyler and Chloe adjusted to their new reality with the resilience that children often demonstrate in the face of trauma. Tyler channeled his anger about his father's betrayal into academic achievement and athletic excellence, determined to prove that Marcus's criminal behavior didn't define his own potential. Chloe remained more emotionally connected to her father despite his crimes, writing him letters in prison and counting down the years until his potential release. 3 years after Marcus's sentencing, I received a letter from him at the Federal Correctional Institution where he was serving his sentence. The letter was carefully written, clearly reviewed by prison authorities before mailing, and focused entirely on his remorse for the pain he'd caused, rather than attempts to justify his actions or request forgiveness he hadn't earned. He wrote about the therapy programs he'd completed, the educational courses he was taking, and his hopes that Tyler and Chloe might someday be willing to maintain some relationship with him despite his failures as a father. Most significantly, he acknowledged that I'd been right to cooperate with federal investigators rather than enabling his continued criminal behavior. He thanked me for protecting our children's future even when doing so had required destroying the illusion of our marriage. I never responded to the letter, but I kept it in case Tyler and Chloe wanted to read it when they were older and better able to process complex feelings about their father's actions and apparent remorse. The children occasionally asked about Marcus and whether they would see him again, but they'd stopped expecting him to return to their daily lives. Their new normal included birthday parties and school events where other children had fathers present, but they'd learned to find stability and security in the life we'd built without him. The security cameras that had revealed Marcus's affair were eventually removed from our new home. I'd installed them initially seeking protection from external threats, never imagining that the real danger to our family's security was living inside our own walls. The technology that had exposed Marcus's deception no longer felt like safety equipment. Instead, it reminded me of how completely I'd failed to recognize the man I'd been married to for 12 years. Looking back on the investigation that had consumed months of my life and ultimately destroyed our family's previous existence, I felt no regret about the choices I'd made. Marcus's criminal activities would have eventually been exposed through other means, and his planned abandonment of our family would have left Tyler and Chloe financially devastated and emotionally traumatized by their father's sudden disappearance. By cooperating with federal investigators when I did, I'd at least maintained some control over the timing and circumstances of our family's crisis. The woman who'd discovered her husband's affair through security camera footage had been naive about both technology and human nature. She'd believed that installing cameras would protect her family from strangers who might threaten their safety, never considering that the greatest threat might be someone with keys to their front door and access to their most intimate spaces. She'd trusted that her husband's professional success was earned through legitimate means, and that his devotion to their family was as genuine as her own. That woman no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more skeptical about the motivations of people who claimed to care about her welfare. The investigation had revealed not just Marcus's capacity for systematic deception, but also my own strength, when forced to protect my children from someone I'd trusted completely. I'd learned that survival sometimes required destroying everything you thought you wanted in order to preserve what actually mattered. Tyler graduated from high school with a full scholarship to study engineering, determined to build things that would last, rather than creating the kind of fraudulent success his father had pursued. Chloe showed talent in dance and theater, channeling her emotional complexity into artistic expression that helped her process feelings too complicated for ordinary conversation. Both children had grown into young adults who understood that integrity and authenticity were more valuable than wealth or status, lessons learned through painful experience with the consequences of prioritizing appearance over reality. 5 years after Marcus's sentencing, I married Dr. Kevin Walsh, the former colleague who'd helped expose the corruption at the city planning office. Our relationship had developed slowly from professional respect to personal friendship to genuine love based on shared values and complete honesty about our respective backgrounds. Kevin understood the importance of transparency and communication in ways that Marcus never had, and he brought patience and stability to our blended family that helped heal wounds left by years of systematic deception. The wedding was small and private, attended only by immediate family and close friends who'd supported us through the difficult years of legal proceedings and financial recovery. Tyler and Chloe participated enthusiastically, having grown to love Kevin for his consistency and genuine care for their welfare, rather than the performative devotion Marcus had demonstrated while secretly betraying their trust. As I stood in our backyard surrounded by people who knew our complete story and chose to celebrate our new beginning anyway, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of authentic happiness. The security cameras that had revealed Marcus's affair had ultimately saved our family from something much worse than infidelity. They'd exposed a web of corruption and planned abandonment that would have left Tyler and Chloe emotionally and financially devastated if it had been allowed to continue. The investigation had taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to destroy the illusion of safety in order to create actual security. Marcus's arrest and imprisonment had been traumatic for our children, but it had also protected them from the far greater trauma of discovering that their father had stolen their future and disappeared with everything their family had worked to build together. Standing there in the sunshine, watching Tyler and Chloe laugh with their new stepfather and the friends who'd become our chosen family, I knew that we'd not only survived Marcus's betrayal, but ultimately been strengthened by it. The truth had been painful beyond anything I could have imagined, but it had also set us free to build something real, rather than continuing to live in a beautiful lie that was destined to collapse. The security cameras were gone, but the security they'd ultimately provided, the security that comes from knowing exactly who you can trust and why, was something no technology could have given us. We'd learned to find safety in truth, rather than in surveillance, in authentic relationships, rather than in carefully maintained appearances. The investigation had ended, but the life it had made possible was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.